She thought he was just a drifter cowboy, but he became the man she could truly trust. Clara Bennett had always lived her life quietly in the small town of Ridgewood. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, where neighbors waved from porches and shopkeepers greeted regular customers by name. Life moved slowly, and people rarely expected anything surprising to happen. Clara, who had lost her father a few years ago, had taken over the small roadside cafe her family owned. She learned quickly how to run it on her own, handling everything from cooking and cleaning to balancing accounts. Though life had been challenging, she had grown resilient, independent, and determined. Running the cafe gave her purpose, but it also meant she spent most of her days alone. Her small circle of friends included a few loyal customers and townspeople who checked in from time to time, but she had grown used to her quiet life. One warm afternoon, Clara was wiping down tables and rearranging chairs when she noticed a man walking slowly along the dusty main road. He wore a faded cowboy hat pulled low over his face and carried a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. His boots were coated with dust, and his clothes looked like they had seen many miles of travel. Clara's first thought was that he was just another traveler passing through, the kind of people who stopped for a quick meal before disappearing again. She went back to her work, keeping an eye on him through the window as he paused in front of her cafe. There was something unusual in the way he stood, though. He didn't rush, didn't seem desperate or aimless. He simply paused, as if considering whether to step inside. After a few moments, the man pushed open the cafe door. A small bell rang as he entered. Clara's first instinct was caution. Strangers in Ridgewood were not common, and people here tended to watch newcomers carefully. The man walked calmly toward the counter, his movements deliberate and unhurried. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, and polite. "Could I get a simple meal and a glass of water, please?" he asked. His accent was soft, unfamiliar to the town, but pleasant to listen to. There was no bravado in his tone, no false friendliness, just a quiet politeness that was almost calming. Clara nodded and prepared his meal. While she worked, she observed him carefully. Unlike most travelers, he didn't fidget or glance around suspiciously. He didn't immediately pull out a phone or take up unnecessary space. He seemed comfortable being in the cafe without trying to dominate the room. When he sat down, he chose a small table near the corner, out of the way, but still within view of the door. He didn't ask for anything else. He didn't try to strike up conversation with other customers. Instead, he simply ate his meal quietly, taking small bites and drinking water slowly. After finishing, he asked politely for the bill. Clara handed it to him, and he placed the exact change on the counter. He offered a gentle smile and thanked her sincerely. There was a sense of humility in his manner, something rare in people who wandered from town to town. Clara couldn't explain why, but she felt an odd sense of trust in him, even though she had just met him. She shrugged off the feeling as curiosity. After all, Ridgewood had always been quiet, and visitors usually passed through without leaving a mark. Over the next few days, the stranger continued to appear around town. Some townspeople were suspicious, whispering to each other about the newcomer. "Probably just another drifter," one man said, shaking his head. "You never know with people like that," a woman added. Clara heard their comments but didn't let them influence her. She noticed small things that others missed. He helped the elderly, carrying groceries or holding doors. He repaired a broken fence post without anyone asking, quietly and efficiently. When a child dropped a toy in the dirt, he picked it up and returned it with a polite nod. Clara found herself observing him more often. Each small act of kindness seemed deliberate but not showy. There was no expectation of reward, no desire for recognition. He simply acted as though it was natural to help where he could. A par for someone who had lived in Ridgewood all her life. Seeing this quiet, dependable behavior from an outsider was unusual. It sparked curiosity in Clara, making her wonder who he was and why he was traveling alone. She learned that his name was Daniel when he returned one morning to sit at the cafe. He didn't volunteer the information directly. When she asked what name he went by, he simply replied, "Daniel. Just Daniel." There was no last name, no backstory, just a simple introduction. Clara accepted it without pressing further. People in Ridgewood were used to knowing each other's histories, but Daniel didn't share much, and he didn't seem bothered by the curiosity around him. Daniel offered to help around the cafe in small ways. He swept the porch when the wind scattered leaves across it, moved chairs back into place, and even fixed a broken hinge on the back door. Clara didn't expect strangers to be so helpful, and she couldn't deny the relief that came with having an extra hand. Yet, she remained cautious. She had learned that kindness didn't always last, that people sometimes left as quickly as they arrived. Despite her reservations, she found herself talking to him more often. Their conversations were simple at first: weather, small talk about the town, questions about food and work, but there was a quiet depth to Daniel's words. He spoke with intention, choosing each word carefully. There was no rush, no need to impress. Clara found it easy to listen, to respond without fear of judgment. She noticed the same careful observation in his eyes that she had seen when he first entered the cafe, a watchfulness that seemed both wary and gentle. The townspeople slowly began to notice Daniel in ways that surprised them. Farmers who had once avoided strangers began accepting his help. A shopkeeper found him unloading boxes without complaint. Even the children grew curious, trailing behind him when he walked past, giggling at his polite smiles. Some people still whispered about the drifter cowboy, but the tone had shifted. There was less suspicion, more intrigue. People began to see him not as a threat, but as someone quietly reliable. Clara, meanwhile, felt a mix of emotions. She was drawn to the calm confidence Daniel carried, yet she remained cautious. I'd learned that life could be unpredictable, and that trusting someone too quickly often led to disappointment. Still, she couldn't ignore the way her day felt lighter when he appeared, how the cafe seemed warmer when he sat quietly at his corner table. There was a quiet energy he brought that made her curious, even if she couldn't explain why. Over time, Daniel became a part of the daily rhythm of Ridgewood, without anyone really noticing how deeply he had begun to integrate. He helped, observed, and participated without demanding attention or recognition. Clara watched him closely, seeing his consistency as a rare quality in a world that often seemed transient and unpredictable. Though most townspeople still labeled him as a drifter, Clara began to sense that Daniel was different. There was a steadiness in his actions, a sense of responsibility without expectation, and a quiet humility that made people feel safe around him. She didn't know his story, and he rarely shared it, but she began to trust him in ways that surprised her. He was reliable, considerate, and present, qualities that had become rare in her life. By the end of the week, Clara realized that Daniel's presence had subtly changed the cafe and the town. Things felt easier, lighter, and more connected. She had begun to imagine small possibilities, what it might mean if someone like Daniel stayed, even briefly. But she didn't let herself hope too much. Drifters, after all, rarely stayed. They moved on, leaving memories but not commitments. Yet as she closed the cafe one evening, wiping down the last table and glancing out the window, she felt something shift. The simple act of seeing Daniel walking back toward the cafe, hat low and boots dusty, carried a sense of promise. Not a promise of grand events, but a quiet one. The possibility that sometimes someone unexpected could bring calm, reliability, and trust into your life, even in the most ordinary of towns. Clara didn't know it yet, but Daniel's arrival would mark the beginning of a journey neither of them could have predicted. A journey that would challenge her patience, her ideas about trust, and her understanding of connection. He was more than just a drifter passing through, though she would only realize that gradually, in small moments, one day at a time. Days turned into weeks in Ridgewood, and Daniel became a quiet presence that the townspeople began to notice more and more. At first, many of them were still suspicious. A man traveling alone with no clear home or family in sight was unusual in a town where everyone knew everyone else. Whispers spread among the townsfolk. Some questioned his intentions. "Why is he here so long?" asked one neighbor. "He doesn't have a place to stay. He's just a drifter," replied another. But despite the whispers, no one could deny the small kindnesses Daniel offered, nor the way he seemed to make life just a little bit easier wherever he went. Clara watched all of this from the cafe, noticing details others overlooked. She saw how Daniel carried himself with quiet confidence and purpose. He never imposed on anyone, but he offered help whenever he could. If someone struggled with a heavy load, he stepped in without being asked. If a horse had wandered loose from a nearby farm, Daniel calmly guided it back. Even small gestures like picking up a piece of trash or holding the door open for a customer spoke volumes about the kind of man he was. Clara began to think about him not as a stranger, but as someone dependable, even though she still reminded herself not to expect too much. One afternoon, as Clara was arranging fresh flowers on the cafe tables, Daniel appeared outside, leaning on the wooden fence by the entrance. He tipped his hat politely and offered a small, warm smile. "Morning, Clara," he said simply. The sound of his voice felt comfortable, familiar, like someone you had known longer than you actually had. Clara returned the greeting, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Morning, Daniel." "How was your walk?" she asked. He shrugged lightly, brushing dust from his coat. "Good. Just needed some fresh air," he said. His words were minimal, yet there was something genuine in the way he said them. Clara noticed that Daniel never exaggerated, never tried to impress anyone. He spoke only when necessary, and when he did, people tended to listen. That morning, A sudden gust of wind blew through the town, rattling windows and sending leaves swirling across the streets. Clara struggled to secure the outdoor tables and chairs while trying not to spill the tea and coffee she carried. The wind caught a small metal sign which clanged loudly, startling a few customers inside. Before Clara could react, Daniel appeared at her side. Without asking, he grabbed the sign and moved it to safety. He helped tie down the chairs and stack the tables against the wall. His movements were steady and confident, and Clara realized that his help felt natural rather than forced. "Thanks," she said, catching her breath. "I didn't expect the wind to be this strong today." Daniel nodded, eyes scanning the street as he replied, "Storms can be unpredictable, but it's always good to be ready." His tone was calm, matter-of-fact, yet there was a subtle reassurance in it that made Clara feel safer. In that small moment, she noticed how easily he adapted to problems and challenges, not with panic, but with quiet strength. After the wind passed, they stood together for a moment, watching the sun peek through the clouds. Clara realized she was beginning to look forward to these small encounters. Even though he said little, Daniel's presence made the cafe feel less lonely. His calm demeanor seemed to slow down the hectic moments of her day. While she had managed on her own for years, his help and companionship reminded her that sharing life's burdens could make things lighter. Daniel continued his quiet routines around town. He fixed a broken gate at the local farm, helped a school janitor move heavy crates of supplies, and even assisted in repairing the old town fountain. People began to talk less about him as a stranger and more about him as a helpful presence. One morning, a group of children ran past the cafe laughing, chasing after a ball. It rolled near Daniel, and he stopped it with his boot, tossing it gently back to the children. Their laughter rang through the streets, and Clara felt warmth in her chest. Here was a man who, without saying much, made a difference in the lives of everyone around him. Despite the growing familiarity, Daniel remained private. He never asked for personal details about anyone, nor did he share much about himself. Clara respected that. She had learned over the years that people often revealed only what they were ready to share. Daniel's quietness didn't feel distant. It felt deliberate, as if he was choosing his actions over words to communicate who he was. One evening, after the cafe closed, Clara and Daniel found themselves sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The town was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of evening light. "You've been here a while now," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Don't you get tired of moving from place to place?" Daniel took a moment before responding. "Sometimes," he said, "but traveling, it teaches you a lot. You see the world differently, meet people you wouldn't otherwise, and you learn to appreciate moments like this." He gestured to the quiet town around them. "Places like this, they remind you that not everything is rushed or complicated." Clara nodded, understanding what he meant. She thought about her own life, how she had been so focused on work and routine that she often forgot to notice these quiet, meaningful moments. Daniel's perspective was refreshing. It made her see Ridgewood in a new light, as a place full of small but important details, if one only paid attention. Over the next several weeks, Clara began noticing subtle changes in her own feelings toward Daniel. At first she had been cautious, reminding herself that he was just passing through, but his consistent kindness, reliability, and gentle presence gradually broke down her walls. She found herself thinking about him during quiet moments in the cafe, wondering what he was doing when he wasn't around. She felt a strange comfort in knowing he would probably return the next day, without any demand or expectation, just to help or to sit quietly. One day, an older man named Mr. Hayes, who lived alone on the outskirts of town, called Clara in a panic. His fence had collapsed during the night and he couldn't repair it on his own. Clara immediately thought of Daniel. She stepped outside and found him tending to the flowers by the porch. "Mr. Hayes needs help with a fence," she said. "Would you mind giving him a hand?" He grabbed a hammer and a few nails and followed her without asking any questions. Together they walked to the farm, where Daniel assessed the damage and began working efficiently. His hands were steady, his movements precise. Clara observed silently, impressed by his skill and patience. The fence was soon repaired, stronger than before. Mr. Hayes looked at Daniel with gratitude, shaking his head. "I didn't expect this kind of help from someone new to town," he said. Daniel simply smiled and nodded. "Sometimes it's the right thing to do," he replied. There was no need for praise or recognition. His actions spoke for themselves, and Clara realized this was why she had begun trusting him so naturally. He didn't seek approval. He simply did what needed to be done. As the days passed, Daniel's reputation in Ridgewood shifted. People who had once been suspicious began relying on him. Farmers asked for his help with chores, shopkeepers called on him to carry heavy goods, and children waved at him with excitement when they saw him walking down the street. Even the mayor, who had initially been wary, invited him to assist with community projects. Daniel never refused. He participated quietly, always with a sense of responsibility rather than pride. Clara noticed that Daniel never stayed too long in anyone's house or took more than he needed. He was respectful, humble, and self-sufficient, yet his presence brought a sense of stability to the town. For Clara, who had managed everything alone for years, this was both comforting and intriguing. She began to see him as more than just a traveler passing through. There was reliability in his actions, a steadiness that felt rare and valuable. One evening, Clara and Daniel shared another quiet moment on the porch. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the gentle breeze carried the smell of freshly baked bread from the cafe. Clara turned to Daniel and asked, "Do you ever think about staying somewhere for longer?" Daniel paused as if considering the question carefully. "I usually move on before I get too comfortable," he said softly. "But places like this, they make you wonder." His words were simple, but Clara could feel the weight behind them. He wasn't making promises, but he wasn't closing himself off either. There was a quiet possibility in his tone, something that made her heart beat a little faster. Clara realized that despite the initial caution she had felt, she had begun to trust Daniel. Not blindly, but because she had observed his character day after day. His actions, his patience, and his quiet strength had shown her who he really was. And, though she knew that people like him often moved on, she couldn't help but hope that maybe, just maybe, he might stay. By the end of the week, Daniel had become an essential part of Ridgewood, not because he demanded attention, but because he offered help, kindness, and reliability without asking for anything in return. Clara saw how the town had begun to rely on him, even as he continued to remain quietly in the background. His presence brought comfort, stability, and a sense of hope that small acts of goodness could truly matter. And though neither of them realized it yet, the bond between Clara and Danielle was slowly taking root. It was not a bond of romance or dramatic gestures, but a bond built on trust, respect, and shared understanding. In a world that often seemed unpredictable and lonely, they were beginning to notice that there was someone who could be counted on, a person whose presence made life a little easier, a little brighter, and a little more meaningful. Life in Ridgewood had settled into its usual rhythm, quiet but comforting. Clara continued to manage her cafe, and Daniel's presence had become a familiar, reassuring part of the town. He helped whenever he could, always quietly, never seeking recognition or praise. Children waved to him on the street, farmers asked for his help with chores, and neighbors began to nod at him with respect. Clara, meanwhile, had grown used to his calm presence and steady reliability, though she still reminded herself that he was a traveler, a drifter, someone who might leave at any moment. But life, as it often does, had a way of testing people's trust. One morning, Clara noticed that a few items were missing from the cafe's storage room. At first, she thought it might have been misplacement. Things sometimes get moved during the rush of daily work. But then she discovered that a few small but valuable items from other parts of town were also missing. Tools, supplies, and even some personal items from neighbors' homes had vanished. Rumors quickly spread. Some of the townspeople began whispering in the streets. Their suspicion fell naturally on Daniel, as he was still technically an outsider. "It has to be him," one woman muttered. "He's only passing through, and now things are disappearing." Others nodded, hesitant but curious. Clara overheard these whispers and felt a strange tension gnawing in her stomach. She had come to trust Daniel, but these rumors made her pause. Was it possible that she had misjudged him? When Daniel came into the cafe later that morning, Clara noticed the same calm, steady demeanor he had always carried. He greeted her with a polite nod. "Morning, Clara," he said, his voice as soft and composed as ever. Clara hesitated. She didn't want to accuse him, but she also couldn't ignore the growing unease in the town. "Daniel," she began carefully, "some things have gone missing in town. People are worried." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes searched his face for any sign of guilt. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying her expression. He didn't look defensive, angry, or anxious. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if he had expected this moment to come. "I understand," he said quietly. "I've noticed some of the concern. I want to help." He didn't demand to defend himself, and Clara felt a small flicker of reassurance. Patient, willing to help, was consistent with the man she had come to trust. There was no defensiveness, no irritation. He simply wanted to find the truth. Clara nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and continued concern. "Can we check the cafe first?" she asked. Daniel agreed. Together, they began searching every corner, every shelf, and every storage area. Their movements were methodical and careful. Daniel's presence made the work easier. He lifted heavy boxes without complaint, inspected high shelves with steady hands, and calmly guided Clara through the search. After nearly an hour, they found the source of the missing items. A loose window latch in the back storage room had caused a small stack of supplies to fall behind a heavy crate. Items had appeared missing simply because they had shifted out of sight. The neighbors' tools and materials had been scattered by wind or accident, not theft. Nothing had been stolen. Clara exhaled a deep sigh of relief, her tension dissolving. She looked at Daniel, gratitude and a small embarrassment in her eyes. I'm sorry, she said softly. I doubted you, even for a moment. Daniel smiled, but it was a quiet, understanding smile. It's all right, he said. People will worry when things go missing. It doesn't mean they don't trust you. It's natural to wonder. This small incident, though resolved, left an impression on Clara. She realized how easily people could be misjudged and how fragile trust could be. Daniel's reaction had strengthened her faith in him. His patience, his willingness to help without complaint, and his calm demeanor proved that he was not just reliable but trustworthy in ways she hadn't fully appreciated before. The townspeople eventually discovered the truth as well. Mr. Hayes, who had been the first to notice missing tools, realized that the wind and loose storage had caused the confusion. Apologies spread among the neighbors, and the whispers of suspicion were replaced with quiet gratitude. Daniel's reputation improved even further. What had once been suspicion and doubt now became respect. People recognized his consistent kindness, his willingness to help, and his calm, dependable nature. Clara noticed another subtle change in her own feelings toward Daniel. Before, she had appreciated his help and enjoyed his company, but now she saw him in a deeper light. She recognized that trust, once tested and proven, could grow into something more meaningful. She no longer worried about whether he might leave. She felt confident in his integrity and character. There was comfort in knowing that someone she had come to respect so deeply was consistent, patient, and reliable. Despite the resolved incident, Daniel's presence continued to quietly impact Ridgewood. He helped with chores on farms, repaired broken fences, and assisted the shopkeepers when they needed extra hands. Even the children, who had once been shy around him, now sought him out, laughing as they ran errands or played games. Daniel never complained or sought attention. He simply moved through the town with quiet purpose, offering help and care where it was needed. One day, Clara observed him repairing an old water pump near the edge of town. Sweat glistened on his forehead, and his hands were rough from work, but he smiled as he tightened the last bolt. The pump worked perfectly again, and the farmer who owned it clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "You've got a gift, Daniel," he said. "Thank you." Daniel nodded humbly. "I just do what I can," he replied. No boast, no expectation, just quiet competence. Clara watched from a distance, feeling a sense of admiration she hadn't expected. She realized that his character wasn't just defined by actions, but by intention, helping because it was right, not for recognition or reward. As the days passed, Clara found herself sharing small moments with Daniel. They spoke about simple things, the weather, town events, or the occasional visitor passing through Ridgewood. Their conversations, though often brief, carried warmth and comfort. Daniel never pressured her into talking about herself, but she found that she wanted to share pieces of her life anyway. She told him about her father, about running the cafe alone, and about the small challenges that came with life in Ridgewood. Daniel listened attentively. He didn't interrupt or offer unsolicited advice. Instead, he offered a listening ear and quiet support, which Clara realized was far more valuable than any words of instruction. In sharing her thoughts, she felt a sense of relief, a release of burdens she had carried silently for years. One evening, after the cafe had closed and the streets were quiet, Clara and Daniel sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air was crisp, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from the cafe. "I've learned something about trust recently," Clara said softly. "It's not always easy to give, especially when you've been disappointed. But seeing you, it's made me realize that some people are worth trusting." Daniel turned his gaze to the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "Trust is rare," he said quietly. "It's something that takes time and consistency, but once it's earned, it becomes stronger than anything else." Clara nodded, feeling a warmth in her chest. She realized that the small moments of honesty, help, and patience had built something stronger than simple familiarity. They had created trust, a quiet, steady foundation that could withstand doubts, rumors, and challenges. Over the following weeks, Daniel continued to work and assist in Ridgewood. Each day reinforced the impression he had made. He never asked for anything beyond simple meals, a place to rest, and a chance to contribute, and in return, he gave the town something invaluable: reliability, honesty, and a reminder that kindness could be both humble and powerful. Clara began to see him not as a drifter, but as someone who could be trusted without question. She realized that trust was not just about believing someone would act rightly. It was about seeing their consistent character over time. Daniel had proven through countless small actions that he was dependable, patient, and genuine. And for Clara, who had learned the hard way that life could be uncertain and people unreliable, this realization was profound. By the end of Part 3, Ridgewood had shifted subtly. Where once there had been suspicion and caution, there was now quiet respect and appreciation. Daniel had shown the town that actions often spoke louder than words, and for Clara, the experience had been personal as well as communal. She had learned the value of patience, observation, and quiet trust. Though the future remained uncertain, Daniel could still leave at any time. Clara knew one thing. When someone's character is proven, trust becomes more than a fleeting feeling. It becomes a bond, a foundation for connection, and a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful relationships are built not on grand gestures, but on small, consistent acts of integrity and kindness. Over the next few weeks, the bond between Clara and Daniel deepened in ways that were quiet but meaningful. Life in Ridgewood continued its slow rhythm, but for Clara, there was a new sense of warmth that had not been there before. Daniel's presence, once just helpful and reassuring, had started to feel personal. She found herself noticing small things about him, the way he would pause to help someone carry a heavy load, the quiet way he listened when people spoke, the subtle kindness in his eyes. It was clear to her that Daniel had lived a life filled with challenges, and yet he carried himself with patience and humility rather than bitterness. Clara herself had been through hardship. Losing her father at a young age had left her to manage the cafe alone, and over the years she had learned to rely only on herself. Friends had come and gone, and neighbors were often busy with their own lives. She had built walls around her heart, careful not to trust too quickly. But Daniel was different. He did not demand trust or attention. He earned it slowly through consistent actions, through the quiet way he showed care for the people around him. One afternoon, a storm rolled over Ridgewood unexpectedly. Dark clouds filled the sky, and strong winds rattled the windows of the cafe. Rain began to pour, making the streets slick and muddy. Clara struggled to keep the cafe organized as she moved tables and chairs to shelter from the wind. Daniel appeared without being called. He moved confidently, helping her secure the outdoor furniture, tying down loose signs, and closing the back door against the wind. "Thank you," Clara said breathlessly, glancing at him with relief. "I didn't expect the storm to hit so suddenly." Daniel nodded, his calm expression unchanged. "Weather can be unpredictable," he said softly. "It's always best to be prepared." There was no hint of arrogance in his voice, only a gentle assurance that made her feel safer. Watching him work quietly and efficiently, Clara realized once again that his strength was not just physical, but emotional. He faced challenges without panic or complaint, and somehow his calmness rubbed off on her. When the storm passed, they sat on the porch steps together, listening to the rain slow to a gentle drizzle. Clara noticed the way Daniel's eyes softened when he looked at her, a subtle warmth that made her heart flutter. She had not expected to feel this kind of closeness with someone she barely knew, and yet it was impossible to ignore. For the first time in years, she felt comfortable sharing small pieces of her life. "I sometimes forget to notice the little things," Clara admitted quietly. "Like how peaceful it can be after a storm, or how kind people can be without expecting anything back. You remind me of that." Daniel smiled faintly, a gentle expression that seemed to carry a quiet understanding. Life teaches us slowly," he said. "Sometimes it's the small things that matter the most. And sometimes the right people show up at the right time, even if it doesn't seem important at first." Clara nodded, feeling a warmth in her chest she could not explain. There was a comfort in his presence, a trust that went beyond simple reliability. She realized she wanted to share more with him, but she was unsure how much he would be willing to reveal about himself. Daniel had always been private, sharing very little about his past or why he traveled from town to town. Yet there was an unspoken understanding between them that words were not always necessary to communicate trust and care. As the weeks went by, Daniel began to share small fragments of his past. One evening, while helping Clara close the cafe, he spoke softly about the towns he had passed through over the years. He had moved frequently, taking odd jobs wherever he could find them, always careful not to stay too long. He admitted that he had been hurt before, friendships that ended unexpectedly, promises broken, and people leaving without warning. "I learned that it's safer to keep moving," he said, his gaze distant for a moment. "It's easier to leave before you're left behind." but sometimes moving isn't what your heart really wants. Clara listened closely, sensing the vulnerability in his voice. She realized that beneath his calm exterior was a man who had experienced loss and disappointment, yet who chose to remain kind and helpful. His actions in Ridgewood were not accidental. They reflected a deliberate choice to treat people with respect and care, even when life had taught him to expect the opposite. Clara shared pieces of her life in return. She spoke about her father, the cafe, and the loneliness she had sometimes felt in running the business alone. She admitted that, while she appeared strong on the outside, she often felt uncertain and vulnerable inside. Daniel listened without judgment, offering a comforting presence rather than advice. His quiet attention made it easier for her to speak, and she found herself opening up more than she had with anyone in years. Their conversations often ended with comfortable silences, moments when words were unnecessary. They shared simple routines, preparing the cafe together in the morning, walking through the town square, helping neighbors with chores. Each shared experience built a foundation of trust and mutual respect. Clara began to notice that she no longer worried about what Daniel might do. She simply trusted that he would act with integrity, as he had shown repeatedly. Meanwhile, the town continued to appreciate Daniel's presence. Neighbors who had once been suspicious now sought his help with confidence. Farmers relied on him to repair fences, shopkeepers invited him to assist with deliveries, and children ran to him with laughter in their eyes. Daniel had become a quiet but essential part of the community, earning respect without demanding it. One day, Clara and Daniel walked along the edge of town, watching the sunset together. The sky was painted in brilliant oranges and pinks, and a gentle breeze carried the smell of fresh bread from the cafe. Clara felt a sudden sense of clarity. "You've changed the way I see people," she said softly. "I used to think trust was fragile, something I couldn't afford to give easily. But with you, it feels natural." Daniel glanced at her, a faint smile on his face. "Trust is earned," he said. "Not given blindly. But when someone shows patience, kindness, and consistency, it becomes easy to believe in them." Clara realized that this was exactly what had happened between them. Daniel's actions, small but consistent, had built a foundation of trust. His patience and quiet strength had shown her that not all people would disappoint, that not all strangers were temporary or unreliable. And in turn, she had learned to open her heart carefully, trusting that he would not take advantage of it. Over time, their bond grew stronger. Daniel became more willing to share his thoughts, though he remained private about his deeper past. He spoke of hopes, of simple joys, and of lessons learned from traveling. Clara appreciated the honesty, realizing that it was rare for someone to share these insights without seeking attention or validation. Their conversations, though often simple, carried a depth that went beyond words. Clara also noticed her own growth. She felt more confident, more open, and more capable of accepting help. Daniel's presence had reminded her that life did not have to be carried alone, that sharing burdens did not weaken her but strengthened her instead. She began to see the value of human connection, patience, and quiet support. The town noticed subtle changes as well. People who had been skeptical of Daniel now included him in community gatherings. He participated without boasting, his quiet contributions making him respected and valued. Clara watched with a sense of pride and warmth. This man, who had entered Ridgewood as a stranger, had become a trusted presence, not through grand gestures, but through consistent kindness and patience. One evening as they closed the cafe together, Clara turned to Daniel and asked gently, "Do you think you could ever stay here longer? Not just passing through, but really stay?" "I don't know," he said softly. "I've always moved on before I get too comfortable. But being here, with people I trust in a place that feels right, makes me wonder if staying might be worth it." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. She realized that trust had grown between them, not suddenly but gradually, built on shared experiences, honesty, and understanding. It wasn't a fleeting feeling. It was something deeper, stronger, and more enduring. As the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows over the town, Clara and Daniel stood together in quiet reflection. Neither spoke for a long moment. They didn't need words. The trust, the respect, and the quiet connection between them was enough. It had grown from simple actions, small gestures, and the consistent presence of someone who had shown, time and again, that he could be counted on. And for Clara, this realization was profound. She had once thought that trust was fragile, something easily broken. Now she understood that it could grow stronger through patience, observation, and shared experience. Daniel was no longer just a helpful stranger. He had become someone she could rely on, someone whose integrity had been proven in the smallest but most meaningful ways. Days turned into weeks, and Ridgewood settled into its usual calm rhythm. The cafe continued to thrive under Clara's careful management, and Daniel remained a quiet yet steady presence in town. Over time, people had grown used to him. Children waved as he walked by, farmers relied on his help with chores, and neighbors greeted him with respect and appreciation. But even with all the familiarity, Daniel remained quietly cautious. Though he had begun to feel a sense of belonging, he still struggled with old habits. For years, he had moved from town to town, avoiding attachment, keeping his distance to protect himself from disappointment. One crisp morning, Clara noticed Daniel packing a small bag near the back porch of the cafe. She felt a sudden twinge of worry in her chest. "Daniel, are you leaving?" she asked softly, trying to keep her voice calm. Daniel looked up, his expression serious but calm. "I'm thinking about it," he said. "I don't know if it's right to stay. I've always moved on before I got too comfortable." She had come to rely on his presence, and she had grown to trust him deeply. She thought about all the moments they had shared, the small acts of kindness, the quiet conversations on the porch, the way he had helped the town without ever asking for recognition. She realized that she did not want him to leave, but she also understood that she could not force his decision. She took a deep breath and spoke honestly. "Daniel, you've done so much for this town, and for me personally, I can't tell you what to do, but I need you to know you've earned a place here. Not because anyone forced it, but because of who you are. Trust is not about promises, it's about choices, and you can choose to stay if you want, but it has to be your choice." Daniel paused, looking down at the bag in his hands. For a moment, he said nothing. The wind moved gently, carrying the faint scent of fresh bread from the cafe. The town was quiet, calm, waiting in its own way for his decision. He looked up at Clara, and for the first time she saw vulnerability in his eyes, a hint of fear mixed with hope. He began slowly. "I've spent years moving on because it felt safer. I've always believed that staying meant risking loss. But Ridgewood feels different. People here trust me, they appreciate me, and you've shown me that trust can be real. Maybe staying isn't as risky as I thought." Clara felt a surge of relief and warmth. She knew that his choice was not made lightly. Daniel was not someone to act impulsively. His decision to stay was deliberate, thoughtful, and meaningful. It was more than a promise. It was a conscious act of trust, a step toward allowing himself to be part of a community, part of someone else's life. Over the next few days, Daniel settled into a rhythm that was more permanent. He continued helping in the cafe, assisting neighbors, and participating in small projects around town. But there was a new difference now. He acted not as a temporary helper, but as someone with a place, a role, and a sense of belonging. Ridgewood had become his home, not just a stop on a journey. Clara noticed subtle changes in her own life as well. The cafe felt warmer not just because of the work they shared, but because of the presence of someone who had earned her trust so completely. She found herself sharing more, laughing more, and feeling more comfortable asking for help when needed. It was a partnership built on respect, understanding, and a quiet acknowledgement of each other's value. The townspeople also noticed. Daniel's efforts were no longer seen as temporary acts of kindness, but as evidence of his commitment to the community. Children followed him on errands, farmers invited him to assist with larger projects, and neighbors sought his advice and help more often. He became a trusted figure, someone people relied on without hesitation. One afternoon, Clara and Daniel walked along the outskirts of town, watching the hills bathed in the soft glow of the evening sun. The sky was a warm mixture of oranges and purples, and the gentle breeze carried the smell of the countryside. "I can't believe how much this town has changed since you arrived," Clara said quietly. "And not just the town. Me too. I feel lighter somehow. Safer. Happier." Daniel glanced at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "It's not just me," he said softly. "You've changed too. You've taught me that trust doesn't have to be scary, that it's okay to care about people, even if you've been hurt before. And you've shown me that staying somewhere, really staying, can be the right choice." She realized that their connection had grown far beyond friendship. It was built on patience, kindness, shared experiences, and the quiet understanding that each could rely on the other. There were no dramatic gestures or grand proclamations, only the small, consistent acts that had built a deep foundation of trust. In the following weeks, Daniel became fully integrated into Ridgewood life. He helped at the community center, assisted the local school with maintenance, and continued supporting neighbors with their daily chores. Children ran to greet him every morning, and the townspeople welcomed him with warmth and respect. He had earned a place not just physically in the town, but in the hearts of the people who lived there. Clara and Daniel continued to spend time together, often quietly working side by side in the cafe or sitting on the porch in the evenings watching the sunset. They shared thoughts about life, hopes for the future, and small joys that many people overlooked. Their bond grew stronger every day, built on trust, mutual respect, and shared understanding. One evening, after closing the cafe, Clara turned to Daniel with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think that people like you only pass through towns, that they can't stay, that they're too careful, too guarded. But you've proven that isn't always true. You've shown me that people can choose to stay, to trust, and to care." Daniel looked at her, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the sunset. "I've learned that too," he said. "I'd spent so long avoiding attachment because I was afraid of being hurt. But staying here, being part of this town, being part of your life, feels right, and it's worth it." Clara smiled, feeling a sense of completeness she had not known for years. She realized that the story of trust and companionship was not about grand gestures or dramatic events. It was about consistent, quiet choices, choosing to help, choosing to listen, choosing to stay. And in Daniel she had found someone who embodied these choices fully, someone she could rely on completely. In the months that followed, Ridgewood thrived not just because of Daniel's hard work, but because of the sense of community and trust he helped reinforce. Clara's cafe flourished with the energy he brought, the small gestures that made life smoother, and the steady companionship that made her daily work feel lighter. The relationship remained simple, honest, and genuine. There were no grand declarations, no overt displays, just a deep and growing bond based on shared life, mutual respect, and trust. Clara had learned to open her heart carefully, trusting that Daniel would not betray it, and even when it felt risky, could bring profound fulfillment. And so life in Ridgewood continued, steady and warm. Clara once believed that the stranger who had walked into her cafe was just another traveler passing through. She had been cautious, unsure, and even wary at times. But Daniel had proven, day by day, through quiet acts and consistent character, that he could be trusted completely. He was no longer a drifter. He was a part of the town, a part of her life, and someone whose presence brought comfort, strength, and joy. In the end, their story was not about grand adventures or dramatic changes. It was about trust, patience, and the quiet courage to open one's heart again. Together, Clara and Daniel had built something rare, a bond rooted in respect, reliability, and understanding. They had discovered that even those who have wandered far and faced hardship can find a place to belong. And sometimes the most meaningful connections appear when they are least expected, growing slowly, quietly, and beautifully into something lasting. Ridgewood would never be the same after Daniel's arrival, and Clara would never forget the day she realized that the man she had once thought was just a drifter cowboy had become the one person she could truly trust. Together, they faced life with patience, kindness, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes home is not a place, it's the people you choose to stay with and the trust you build one day at a time.